between supply and quantity supplied, how demand and supply together can determine the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in the market. I'll also teach you what are the factors that affect the demand, what are the factors that act as demand shifters, and what are the factors that act as supply shifters. So let's first have a look at the definition for quantity demanded. The quantity demanded of any good is the amount of the good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Remember that quantity demanded and demand, they're two different things. Demand and quantity demanded, they're two different things. Just now I gave you the definition of quantity demanded. It will be clear maybe in the next couple of slides what's the basic difference between quantity demanded and demand. Before having a look at that, let's understand the law of demand. The law of demand says that it's basically the claim that the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of the good rises, other things equal. So if price goes up, quantity demanded falls. If price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. That's the law of demand. Now let's have a look at the demand schedule. The demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. So here, this table that you see here, this table here is the demand schedule. We have price of lattes on the left hand side, and we have quantity of lattes demanded on the right hand side. Let's see how we can read this table. According to this table, when the price of lattes is $0, the quantity of lattes demanded is 16. But if price of lattes increases from $0 to $1, quantity of lattes demanded falls from 16 to 14 because lattes have become more expensive. If lattes become even more expensive now, if the price increases from $1 to $2, then the quantity of lattes demanded falls from 14 to 12. Okay, please pay attention to the words that I'm using here. I'm saying that when price increases, quantity of lattes demanded falls. I'm not saying that demand for lattes is falling. Okay, I am not saying that demand for lattes is falling. Rather, I'm saying quantity of lattes demanded falls. A fall in demand and a fall in quantity of lattes demanded are two different things. We'll have a look at the difference later on, but for now just understand that when the price changes, then the quantity of lattes demanded changes. The demand doesn't change. If the price of lattes changes, then the only thing that changes is the quantity of lattes demanded, not the demand for lattes. Okay? So this was example for Helen's demand for lattes. Let's have a look at the graph for demand schedule. So if you graph this table, what you get is the demand curve. Okay, so we graph this demand schedule and we get this demand curve. On the vertical axis, we have the price of lattes. Okay, here on the vertical axis, we have the price of lattes. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of lattes. So if we plot these points, $0 and 16 lattes, that's this point right here. This is that point. And if you plot the next pair of points, which is $1 and 14 lattes, so that's 1 here and 14 lattes right here. So that's the second point. Similarly, you can find all other points. So after you graph all these pair of points, you get this demand curve. This is the demand curve for lattes. This is Helen's demand curve for lattes. And obviously, as you see from here, it's a downward sloping curve. A downward sloping curve has a negative slope. So this downward sloping curve tells you that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, when price is high, when the price of lattes is $6, quantity demanded is only 4. But when the price falls, quantity demanded increases from 4 to 6. Okay, so when price changes, when price of lattes changes, we observe a movement along the demand curve. Okay, for example, when price falls from $6 to $5, the quantity of lattes demanded falls from 4 to 6. 4 to 6. So we call this a movement along the curve. Again, if the price of lattice is $5 initially, then it falls from $5 to $4, then the quantity demanded increases. The quantity demanded increases from 6 to 8. So that's the movement from this point to this point. Again, when the price of lattice falls, we have a movement along this demand curve, and when the price of lattice falls, typically we have a downward movement along the demand curve. But if the price of lattice increases from 5 to 6, then we have an upward movement along the demand curve. For example, from this point to this point, that's an upward movement along the demand curve. Okay, next question that you might have in your mind is it always the case that we have a downward sloping demand curve? Well, that's the very typical case. This is the typical case, but sometimes we can have a horizontal demand curve, which is like this, a flat demand curve like this, or we can have a vertical demand curve, which might look like, let me see if I can show you here. Yeah, we can also have a demand curve which looks like this, which is vertical. Okay, a demand curve like this, which is vertical. So when is the case? When is the case where we have this vertical demand curve? Okay, we might have a vertical demand curve if the demand for lattes is not dependent on price of lattes. Okay, so we don't really care about the price of lattes. The only thing that we care about is a quantity demanded. Okay, so it's suppose this, I guess this point is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so 9.5. So the only thing that we care is only 9.5 lattice. We don't really care about the price. We are ready to pay as much as $6 or even more than that to get 9.5 lattice. We are also ready to pay $1 for 9.5 lattice. Okay, so the main thing here is that we might have a vertical demand curve when the quantity demanded is independent of the price of lattice. When the quantity demanded is independent of the price, it does not depend on price. Okay, so let's go back to for initial case. I think I have to swing this. This is not working. Let's see. Yeah, let's just leave it here like that. Come back to this later and fix it. Okay. So far we have only talked about a single person's demand schedule, that is Helen's demand schedule. So how do we get the market demand? So suppose that in the market we only have two consumers, Helen and Ken. So these are the quantity demanded of Helen's. These are the quantity demanded of Helen, and in this column you see the quantity demanded of Ken. Okay, so when the price of latte is 0, Helen's quantity demanded is 16, and Ken's quantity demanded is 8. If you sum these two up, you get 24, which is the market quantity demanded. So basic idea here is that you collect the information about the quantity demanded of all individuals, then you sum them up, that gives you market quantity demanded. So for all different prices, for every price we have the market quantity demanded. Okay, for example, when the price is $5, Helen's quantity demanded is 6, Ken's quantity demanded is 3. If you sum them up, you get the market quantity demanded, which is equal to 9 when the price equals $5. And by plotting the price and the market quantity demanded, you can find the market demand curve. Okay, so again, this is the demand schedule, this table here, but when you plot this table, you get the market demand. In other words, this single point here, 24 and 0, okay, this single point here, 24, is a quantity demanded. But if you take into account this whole table, if you take into account all different possible combinations of quantity demanded for different prices, you get the demand. For example, again, when the price equals $2, we say that the quantity demanded is 18. We do not say that the demand is 18. Rather, demand is this whole thing, this whole table, or this whole curve. Okay, that's the demand. But if you take a single point, on this curve, for example, this point here, if you take a single point on the demand curve, or this point here, this small point here, this small point represents the quantity demanded, but this whole curve represents demand. So there is a difference between demand and quantity demanded. So far we have only discussed the movement along the demand curve. You might have a very legitimate question in your mind: when can we have a shift in the demand curve? When would this demand curve shift to the right, or when would it shift to the left? Okay, let's have a look at that case now. Demand curve shifters. The demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, other things being equal. So these other things are non-price determinants of demand. Okay, it can be the taste of the buyer. Okay, it can also be what else? Changing the taste of the buyer. It could also be the number of buyers. Okay, we'll have a look at these cases separately. So let's start with the number of buyers. The number of buyers is one of the demand curve shifters. When there is an increase in the number of buyers, we also see there is an increase in quantity demanded at each price. Okay, so when the quantity demanded at each price changes, the whole demand curve shifts outward. Let's have a look at this here. So the initial demand curve is given by this gray curve. This is the initial demand curve, the gray curve. Now suppose that the number of buyers increases. If the number of buyers increases, then at each price, the quantity demand is going to go up. Okay? Previously, when the price was $1, quantity demanded was 21. Quantity demanded was 21 according to this gray demand curve. Now, because the number of buyers has increased, at the same price $1, the quantity demanded is not going to be 21 anymore. Rather, it's going to increase from 21 to say somewhere at this point maybe 20, 25, 20, 26. It increased from 21 to 26. Okay, only because the number of buyers increased. Similarly, when the price previously was $2, the quantity demanded was 18. Quantity demanded was 18, but now because the number of buyers has increased, the quantity demanded at this price is also going to increase from 18 to 25. Suppose that's the point 25, or maybe maybe 24. Anyway, the main point here is that for all different prices, for $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, or $6, for all different prices, you can see that the quantity demanded has increased. For example, when the price was $6 previously, quantity demanded was 6. But now, because there are more buyers than before, there has been an increase in the number of buyers. The quantity demanded at this price, $6, is going to increase as well. So the quantity demanded at $6 is not going to be 6 anymore. Rather, it's going to increase from 6 to maybe it's 9, from 6 to 9. So the quantity demanded rises from 6 to 9. So you can see that the quantity demanded is increasing at all different price levels, from this point to this, from this point to this, from this point to this. So for all different prices, the quantity demanded is increasing, and that translates into an outward shift or a rightward shift in the demand curve, and we say that there has been an increase in demand. Okay, so this is the increase in demand. When the demand curve shifts outward, we say that there is an increase in demand. The opposite case is the fall in demand, where the demand curve shifts to the left. If the demand curve shifts to the left instead of shifting to the right, okay, we say that there has been a fall in demand. And one such case is where we have a decrease in number of buyers. If the number of buyers falls, then we can have a fall in demand. That means a leftward shift in the demand curve. Again, There is a difference between an increase in demand and increase in quantity demanded. When there is an increase in demand, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. But when there is an increase in quantity demanded, that basically means that we have a movement along the curve, and that is typically associated with a fall in price. So suppose that the price falls from $4 to $3. If price falls from $4 to $3, then the quantity demanded is going to increase from 12 from this point to this point, so from 12 to 15. So when price falls, quantity demanded increases, but demand doesn't increase. Demand still stays the same. The demand is still given by this gray curve. The demand increases in this particular case when the number of buyers increases. Okay, so when the price falls, you don't see a increase in demand, rather you see an increase in the quantity demanded, which is given by downward movement along the demand curve. Okay, so the demand curve doesn't change when there is a fall in price, but if the number of buyers changes, then the demand curve is going to shift to the right, and we say demand changed. Okay, another demand curve shifter is income. Before we talk about this, you have to know the difference between a normal good and an inferior good. So a normal good is a type of good, the demand for which increases when your income goes up. So if your income increases, the demand for these types of goods typically increases. For example, luxury cars. Luxury cars are a good example of normal good. Or maybe branded soaps. When your income increases, you start buying branded soaps or branded shower gels. And inferior goods are those goods demand for which falls when your income increases. For example, non-branded soaps or non-branded soups or cup noodles maybe. So whenever your income increases, you stop buying those and you move to something which is a better quality. And those goods are, so these goods from which you switch away are inferior goods. So demand for normal good is positively related to income, as I already said. When your income goes up, the demand for normal goods goes up. That's because that's how normal goods are defined. So increase in income causes increase in quantity demanded at each price, and that shifts the demand curve to the right. Okay, so suppose that this gray curve is the demand for branded soaps, okay, or maybe the demand curve for luxury cars or good cars. Suppose that your income increases. If your income increases, then at all different prices, your quantity demand is going to increase as well. If the price of the luxury car is $6,000, previously your quantity demanded was 6, but now because your income has increased, you're gonna demand your quantity demanded is gonna increase. So it's gonna increase from 6 to maybe 9. Sorry, 6 to I guess that's 11. 6 to 11. So the main point here is that whenever your income increases, the demand curve shifts outward. Okay. So first example was the increase in number of buyers. The second example is when your income increases, then the demand curve shifts outward as well. Okay, the third example is the prices of related goods. This one is another interesting and important example. To understand this concept, you have to understand what we mean by substitutes first. What's the definition of substitutes? So according to this slide, two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one causes an increase in the demand for the other. For example, Pepsi and Coke. These two goods are substitutes. When the price of Pepsi goes up, your demand for Pepsi would actually, your quantity demand of Pepsi would go down, but the demand for Coke goes up. Okay, because Pepsi and Coke, these two goods are substitutes. When Pepsi becomes more expensive, you'd switch to Coke and you'd buy more Coke. So your demand for Coke would increase. Now here's the interesting thing. When the price of Pepsi increases, we'd be looking at, let's say let's see. Okay, let's have a look at this curve. And the Pepsi, suppose that initially the price of Pepsi was $3. Now if price of Pepsi increases from 3 to 4, then the quantity demanded falls from 15 to 12. 15 to 12, right? That's the case of Pepsi. So we have an upward movement along the demand curve for Pepsi when the price of Pepsi increases. But it's going to be a totally different picture when we look at Coke's demand curve. Because Pepsi has become more expensive, quantity demanded of Pepsi falls, but the demand for Coke increases. Pay attention to the words that I'm using. I'm saying that the demand for Coke increases. Coke's price hasn't changed at all. Coke's price hasn't changed at all. The only thing that has changed here so far is a change in the price of Pepsi. Okay, is the price of Pepsi that has changed, but the price of Coke hasn't changed. But the demand for Coke is gonna change because Pepsi has become more expensive, so people would like to switch to something which is cheaper. In this case, Coke is cheaper, so demand for Coke is gonna increase. And when demand for Coke increases, the demand curve for Coke would shift outward, like this case here. If this gray curve represents the initial demand curve for Coke, okay, and if we have an increase in the price of Pepsi, then the demand for Coke is gonna go up, which should be represented by an outward shift in the demand curve for Coke. So this red curve now gives you the new demand curve for Coke. Okay, and that's what we mean by the prices of related goods acting as a demand curve shifter. Okay, so if two goods are substitutes, then if the price of one of these substitute changes, then the demand for the other good should also change. Okay, and another example related to these prices of related goods. We just talked about substitute. Now we're going to talk. We will define complements. Two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one causes a fall in the demand for the other. For example, shoes and socks. These two are complements. These two goods, shoes and socks. When the demand for shoe goes up, the demand for socks also goes up. Okay. Or I should say, if the price of shoe falls, then the demand for socks should increase. Okay, there is one more example, is tea and sugar. When the price of tea falls, demand for sugar goes up because these two goods are complement, they go hand in hand. So whenever there is a fall in the price of one good like shoe, then the demand for socks would go up, so the demand curve for socks would shift to the right. But if the price of shoe increases, then the demand for socks is gonna fall, and that's why the demand curve for socks would shift to the left. But what would happen to the demand curve for shoes? Well, nothing would happen to the demand curve for shoes because the price of shoes has fallen. Because the price of shoes has fallen, you'll only experience a movement along the curve, no shift. No shift in the curve. Remember that you'll have a shift in the curve only when your income increases, or the price of the substitute has changed, or the price of the complement has changed, or the next case where the taste of the consumers has changed. So anything that causes a shift in tastes toward a good will increase demand for that good and shift its curve to the right. Suppose that for some unknown reason people has started liking mango more than before. So if people for some unknown reason has started liking mango more than before, then the demand for mango is gonna go up. Remember again that the price of mango hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is the taste in the taste for mango. Okay, people's taste for mango has changed, and that's why people's demand for mango is gonna increase, and the demand curve would shift to the right. Okay, that's another example of a demand curve shifter. So summary, in this table I summarize the variables that influence buyers, that influence the demand. So First variable is price. If there is a change in the price of a good, then it causes a movement along the demand curve of that good. Okay, but if there is an increase, if there is a change in the number of buyers, then that shifts the demand curve. If there is a change in income, that also shifts the demand curve. If the price of related goods changes, that also shifts the demand curve. And as a last example, if consumers' taste changes, then that should also lead to a shift in the demand curve. Okay, let's have a look at an exercise now. Draw a demand curve for music downloads. What happens to it in each of the following scenarios and why? The first case is the price of iPods falls. The second case is the price of music downloads falls. And the third case is the price of CDs falls. So the first thing that you have to do is draw a demand curve for music downloads. We do it. The next slide is a downward sloping curve with prices on the horizontal, price of music downloads on the horizontal axis and quantity of music downloads in the price of music downloads on the vertical axis and quantity of music downloads on the horizontal axis. Okay, so D1 is our demand curve, demand for music downloads. So what happens when the price of iPods falls? Okay, iPods and music downloads, you should be able to identify the relationship between these two. These two goods are complements, iPods and musics, right? Because you listen to music on iPods, that's why these two goods are complement. They depend on each other. So if the price of iPods falls, people will be buying more iPods, right? The quantity demanded of iPods would increase. When people are buying more iPods, they'll be downloading more music, right? They'll be downloading more music, and that's why the demand for music is gonna go up. The demand for music is gonna increase. Remember again, the price of music hasn't changed. Only the price of iPods falls. So go back to the previous example if you don't remember. Look at the slide. Look at the relationship between the complements. You'd see that when the price of iPods falls, it should lead to an increase in the demand for music, and that's why we have an outward shift in the demand curve for music. Okay, this is the new demand curve for music downloads. Okay, next question was, what happens if the price of music downloads falls? As I discussed before, if the price of the good falls, then the demand doesn't change, rather the quantity demanded changes. So if the price of music downloads falls, if the price initially was P1, now it falls from P1 to P2, we would see a downward movement along the demand curve of the music download. So we would move from this point to this point. So the quantity demanded increases from Q1 to Q2. Again, the demand is not increasing, rather the quantity demanded is increasing from Q1 to Q2. Whenever the price changes, the quantity demanded changes, the demand doesn't. A demand would change only when your income changes, or the price of a related good changes, or people's taste changes. Just to name a few. Okay, so this was the second question. When the price of music downloads falls, the quantity demanded, the quantity of music downloads demanded increases, but the demand doesn't change. If the demand had changed, then we would see a shift, an outward shift, or maybe a leftward shift in the demand curve. But that didn't happen here. Okay, the third question. What happens when the price of CDs falls? Okay, now you should be able to identify the relationship between CDs and music downloads. They are substitutes, right? CDs and music downloads. So when the price of CDs falls, CDs become less expensive. They become cheaper. When CDs become cheaper, your demand for music downloads would fall, right? Because you'd be buying more CDs than downloading musics. So your demand for music downloads falls. If your demand falls, then you'd see a leftward shift in the demand curve. So your demand for music downloads falls from D1 to D2. Okay, D2 is a new demand curve for music downloads. Okay, so we are done with demand. Now let's have a look at supply. Just like demand, there's a difference between, just like the demand, case of demand, there's a difference between supply and quantity supplied. For now, let's just focus on quantity supplied. The quantity supplied of any good is the amount that sellers are willing and able to sell. Okay, and we also have a law of supply here. Just like we had law of demand, the law of supply is a claim that the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises, other things equal. In plain words, when the price of goods goes up, the producer, the manufacturer wants to supply more, wants to produce more goods, so quantity supplied goes up. When the price of the good falls, the manufacturer or the producer wants to sell less goods. That's why the quantity supplied falls. So there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. That's evident in this supply schedule. You can see when the price of Lattes is 0, the quantity of Lattes supplied is also 0. But when the price increases, the producer wants to produce more. So quantity of Lattes supplied from 0 to it increases from 0 to 3. When there is again an increase in price of Lattes from $1 to $2, the quantity of Lattes supplied increases from 3 to 6. Okay, so as price keeps increasing, quantity of Lattes supplied also keeps increasing. So this whole table, this gives you the supply schedule. Or when you plot this table, you get the supply curve. But if you pick a single point like this, that gives you the quantity of Lattes supplied. That's not supply, okay? But this whole thing together, this whole thing gives you supply. But if you pick a single point, that gives you quantity of Lattes supplied. That's the difference between supply and quantity supplied. So if you plot this whole table, you're going to get Starbucks supply schedule or supply curve. This is a supply of lattes for Starbucks. So as you can see, it's an upward sloping curve, which tells you that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. If you take a single point right here like this point is quantity supplied. It gives you quantity supplied, which is equal to 6. But this whole thing is supply. But if you take a single point like here, this single point gives you quantity supplied equals 15. But if you take into account all different quantities supplied at all different prices, that gives you supply. So again, there is a difference between supply and quantity supplied. When price changes, price of the good changes from it increases from $1 to $2, then quantity supplied increases from 3 to 6. But supply doesn't change. Quantity supplied changes. Whenever the price changes, the supply doesn't change. Rather, quantity supplied changes. Again, when price increases from $2 to $3, then we have a upward movement along the curve. So we move from this point to this point. Okay, and quantity supplied increases from 6 to 9, but supply doesn't change. Supply would have changed if we had an outward shift in the demand curve or a leftward shift an outward shift in the supply curve and a leftward shift in the supply curve. Okay, market supply versus individual supply. So far we have only looked at Starbucks supply of lattes. Suppose that there is one more seller in the latte market. That's jitters. So you sum up the quantity supplied of Starbucks and jitters, and that gives you the market quantity supplied. For example, when the price of lattes is $1, Starbucks is willing to sell 3 lattes and jitters is willing to sell 2 lattes. You sum up these 3 and 2, that gives you the market quantity supplied, which is equal to 5. So when the price of lattes is $1, the quantity supplied in the market is 5 lattes. Okay, so you take all these different prices along with the market quantity supplied. You plot them together, and you get the market supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve. Again, now let's discuss the factors which shift the supply curve. Okay, the supply curve shows how price affects quantity supplied, other things being equal. So these other things are non-price determinants of supply. So if there is something other than price that affects supply, that should shift the supply curve. If there's anything other than the price of that particular good which affects the quantity supplied of the good, then supply curve is going to shift, or the supply is going to increase or decrease. So one of the examples of supply curve shifters is input prices. Examples of input prices include wages that you pay to the workers, the prices of raw materials. Okay, a fall in input prices makes production more profitable at each output price. So firms supply a larger quantity at each price, and the supply curve shifts to the right. Let's have a look at the graph. Suppose the price of milk falls. If the price of milk falls, then at each price, the quantity of lattes supplied will increase. In this particular case, the quantity of lattes is increasing by 5 here. So suppose that initially the supply curve was given by this gray curve. This gray upward sloping curve gives you the initial supply curve of lattes. And previously, if the price was $1, then the market was willing to sell 5 lattes. But now, because the price of milk has fallen, it's cheaper to produce lattes, and that's why producers are willing to sell 10 lattes at the same price, equals $1. Initially, if the price was $2, producers like Starbucks or Jeter's were willing to sell 10 lattes, but now because the price of milk has fallen, it has become cheaper to produce lattes. So Starbucks and Jeter's are willing to sell more lattes at the same price. So instead of selling 10 lattes, they're willing to sell 15 lattes in this case. So you get all these different points for all different prices. You join these points together, you get a new supply curve. In this particular case, this orange upward sloping curve, is a new supply curve when the input prices falls. But if the input prices fell here, but if the input prices actually increased, then you'd observe a leftward shift in the supply curve. The supply curve would have shifted to the left. If the input prices increased, it would make the production process more expensive. Producers would cut down their production at all different prices, and that's why the supply curve would shift to the left. And another example of supply curve shifter is technology. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce a unit of output. So technology determines the efficiency in the production process. The more advanced the technology is, the cheaper typically it is to produce a good. And that's why when you experience an advancement in technology, you typically would also experience a fall in input prices, and that would result in a similar shift in the supply curve, like here. If the technology improved, okay, if we have an advancement in technology, input prices typically fall, and we'd have an outward shift in the supply curve. Another factor which affects the supply curve, or another non-price determinant of a supply curve, is the number of sellers. So if there is an increase in the number of sellers, it would also increase the quantity supplied at each price. So that shifts supply curve again to the right. Okay, so if we have a higher number of sellers than before, then at each different prices, at each different price, the quantity supplied is going to go up. The quantity supplied is going to increase. Like here, let's go back here. Suppose that initially the price was $1 and the quantity supplied in the market was 5. Now suppose that we have more sellers in the market, so at the same price, because of new sellers, the quantity supplied is going to increase from 5 to 10. If the price initially was $2, the quantity supplied in the market previously was 10. But now, because we have more sellers, the quantity supplied is going to increase from 10 to 15. So you get all these points, different points. And if you add them up, you get this new supply curve given by this orange curve as a result of an increase in the number of sellers in the market. Okay. So let's summarize the variables that influence sellers. Variable number 1 is price. Whenever there is a change in price, we also have a movement along the supply curve. If price increases, then we have an upward movement along the supply curve. If price falls, we have a downward movement along the supply curve, but supply doesn't change, only quantity supplied changes whenever there is a change in price. But if input prices change, then we would have a shift in the supply curve. If technology and number of sellers also change, then we would also have shifts in the supply curve. Okay, let's have a look at an example here, an exercise here. So draw a supply curve for tax return preparation software. What happens to it in each of the following scenarios? Retailers cut the price of the software. Okay, so let's first draw the supply curve for tax return preparation software. We know that supply curve looks, it's typically upward sloping. Okay, so that's the supply curve. This is a supply curve for the tax return preparation software. And the first case was where the retailers cut the price of the software. If the price of the software is cut, then price falls from P1 to P2, and we have a movement along the supply curve from this point to this point, which basically means that the quantity supplied falls from Q1 to Q2. Okay, supply doesn't change, but quantity supplied does change from Q1 to Q2. Okay, that's the first question. The second one was, what happens if there is a technological advancement which allows the software to be produced at lower cost, which basically means that the input cost is falling. Okay, and we have already discussed this case before. If there is a technological advancement or if the input cost is falling, then the quantity supplied at each different price is going to go up. That means the supply is going to increase. So we have an outward shift in the supply curve from S1 to S2. The third case, I'm going to skip it. You probably can do it yourself. It's just for your own practice. The third case. Let's have a look at the market equilibrium. Now, if we bring in the supply and demand curve together, this demand curve and supply curve, if we bring this together, the intersection point between these two curves gives us the equilibrium price, which is $3, and equilibrium quantity, which is 15. Okay, so you bring the demand and supply curve together, the intersection point between these two would give you the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, like here. The equilibrium price is the price that equates quantity supplied with quantity demanded. So at this price, when the price equals $3, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. If you look at this table here, it would be clear. When the price equals $3, you can see the quantity demanded is 15 and quantity supplied equals 15. And this should hold true because these two curves are intersecting each other at this point when Q equals 15. So equilibrium quantity is the quantity supplied and quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. It's pretty simple. Let's have a look at this case, which we call surplus or excess supply. Suppose that the market is not in equilibrium. The market is not in equilibrium. Rather, the prevailing price in the market is $5 instead of $3. Okay, we know that when the price is $3, the market is in equilibrium. But if the price is $5, you can see that the quantity demanded at this price is given by the demand curve. So the quantity demanded is 9. And at this price, the quantity supplied would be given by this point of the supply curve, and this is equal to 25. So there is definitely a mismatch between quantity demanded and quantity supplied when the price is $5. In fact, whenever the prevailing price in the market is above the equilibrium price, for example, whenever the prevailing price in the market is above $3, for example $4 or $5, you'd see that the quantity supplied is always bigger than the quantity demanded. And if the quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded, we say that there is an excess supply or there is a surplus. Okay? For example, if price equals $5, quantity demand equals 9 lattes, quantity supplied equals 25 lattes, the difference between 25 and 9 equals 16, so surplus equals 16 here. Okay? So when the sellers are faced with a surplus, they try to increase sales by cutting prices. Okay, because the sellers are overproducing and they want to cut down the price so that they can increase their sales. So facing a surplus, sellers try to increase sales by cutting prices. So they cut their price from $5 to $4, and when the price falls from $5 to $4, you can see the quantity demanded rises. It rises from here to here, from 10, I guess it was initially 9, from 9 to maybe 11 here. So we had a movement, downward movement along the demand curve. At the same time, because the price is falling, quantity supplied falls. It falls from 25 to 20. So again, we have a downward movement along the supply curve, but we still have a surplus here. Still, quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded when the price is $4. Although the surplus has reduced, you can see the size of the surplus here. This is reduced. This is smaller than this surplus here. But still there is a surplus. There is an excess supply in the market, and the producer wants to get rid of this surplus, so they again cut their price. When they again cut their price, we finally come to this equilibrium point where there is no surplus anymore. Okay, prices continue to fall until market reaches equilibrium. So the main point here is that the market does not always start with an equilibrium. Rather, the market gradually moves toward an equilibrium. The opposite case of an excess supply is excess demand. Let's see, where is, okay. The opposite of that is shortage or excess demand. So whenever quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied, we have a shortage. For example, if the prevailing price in the market equals $1, you can see the quantity supplied is pretty low, is given by this point on the supply curve. So quantity supplied equals 5, but the quantity demanded is pretty high, which is 21, and it's quite expected, right? Because the good is pretty cheap. It's only $1, and that's why the quantity demanded is pretty high. So there is a mismatch again between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, but in this case, quantity demanded is much bigger than quantity supplied, and we call this a shortage. And in this particular case, the shortage equals 16 because the quantity supplied is 5, quantity demanded is 21. That is, if you take the difference between these two, that would give you 16, which is the value of shortage here. So whenever there is a shortage in the market, facing a shortage, sellers raise the price because the quantity demanded is pretty high. So the sellers, they raise their price, and when the price rises from $1 to $2, you can see that the quantity demanded falls from this point to this point. So quantity demanded falls, but because price is increasing, quantity supplied should go up according to the law of supply. Okay, quantity supplied goes up, and this shortage it reduces, but still we have not come to the equilibrium. So to come to the equilibrium, the firms again have to increase their prices. So firms again increase price, and then it increases from $2 to $3, which brings us back to the equilibrium point, right here where there is no shortage. So prices continue to rise until market reaches equilibrium. I think that's all for today. I will upload these slides on iLearn. I strongly suggest you to go through all the slides here. Obviously, due to time constraint, I could not cover some of the important topics under this title. So I would suggest that you read all the slides by yourself, and if you have any question, please do feel free to contact me. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.